Thank you so much. We'll now begin 5-minute rounds of questions, alternating between Republicans and Democrats in order of seniority, subject to the early bird rule, and we'll begin that now. We'll start with you, Dr. Merritt. Now, the statutory text that we're dealing with here, Section 106 of NHPA, is ambiguous. It provides simple, broad directions suggesting that federal agencies need to consider effects on historic properties. Now, while there are regulations that spell out some of the details and something of a process, they also leave significant details open to interpretation. As a result, the scope of what can be considered during the consultation process has ballooned rather dramatically. How do you determine the appropriate area of potential effects as you're reviewing them? And how do you keep that area proportionate and relevant to the direct impacts on the project?
Thank you, Chairman, for that question, and I'll nerd out for a second for everybody's sake. So the area of potential effect in 36 CFR 800 is defined by the direct effects, so think about digging, trenching, et cetera, physical impacts. But there are portions of the APE that are dealt with visual, atmospheric, and auditory. It is those parts, those indirect effects, that do draw the APE larger in many cases. I will say of the 1,500 cases that we review a year in Utah, only a few dozen, if not 1% of those cases, have what we would call a variable APE based on those resources. And so, as you point out, it is ambiguous, it is vague. And there's positives for that, and there's also very negatives, as Mr. McDonald has mentioned. And so we work through a consultation process. And so the agency approaches us on a proposed area of potential effects at the SHPO or the TIPO, and then other parties also have an opinion on what that APE could look like. There is need, in my opinion, to better define some of these aspects, to create reliability in establishing APEs and other effects. The other thing I want to say is I have a three-stool approach in Utah: practice, data, and relationships. Practice, to me, is an investment up front of setting up reliable standards. And so for a long time, Section 106 is a very reactive process. I would like to be proactive and come up with established rules as projects come forward. There is a rule book for these proponents and other parties to play by versus having every single process through the sausage grinder end up in a different place.
Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, under the current process, what determines the extent of indirect impacts when you see them, and how can those indirect impacts be objectively and reasonably quantified when determining the adverse effects? Is that part of the difficulty here, is figuring out how to quantify, how to evaluate relative indirect impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we talk about effects, I will go to the parallel law, the National Register of Historic Places. When we designate something eligible for the National Register, we're supposed to say, what are those character-defining features that make that site significant? When we go into the 106 process, that's how we assess the impact of the project. Are we changing those factors that make it eligible for the National Register, those character-defining features? And I have to say, I cannot quantify, and I cannot come up with an objective measure of indirect effects because it is so variable based on the resource itself. A small uranium mine in central Utah is going to be a different assessment than perhaps a tribally important landscape in another part of our state. And so that's why it becomes very tricky when you're assessing those visual and atmospheric and auditory effects to come up with a regular agreed upon pattern. And that's why, again, I go back, I'd like to invest early and set up standards so not every single project has a different outcome.
Right. It would diminish the subjectivity inherent in it, and when you have less subjectivity, you're probably going to have a faster, more straightforward process.
Absolutely, sir. And I think the subjectivity creates frustration from agencies, tribal members, nations, and proponents. I think ambiguity is sometimes the big problem.
Okay. Now, Mr. McDonald, in your testimony, you state that the quote, the NHPA Section 106 implementing regulations define key terms broadly, and over time, these terms have been interpreted inconsistently and sometimes expansively. This is a fundamental issue, isn't it? One with many one that we face with many permitting statutes, including this one, including NHPA, wherein there's a fairly simple procedural requirement in a statute that's been weaponized or it's at least wandered beyond its original scope, the scope of its original understanding. To what extent has this particular lack of clarity in Section 106 delayed MDU's distribution line?
Senator, thank you for the question. In this particular project, it's delayed it on the terms of months more than years, probably about 12 to 18 months in the process. This also is a line where we're dealing with kind of going up the side of a mountain to a certain extent. So our timeline for construction for this one is about a 2-month window from when the snowpack comes off to when we're getting into the portion where it's too dry to work on. So it's not necessarily the consultation process that resulted in that length of delay, but because of the timing of those decisions and how that process has kind of been held up because of the misunderstanding of where we need to look at and where we don't need to look at for projects, or where we need to work with state or tribal partners versus the federal partners in that process. We've missed that window, and now we're waiting another construction season to address that line.
Thank you.